in my book, I talk about the four ways in which things end up in Western museums. You've got soldiers who engage in military plunder. You've got scholars who do excavations and expeditions. You have dealers who are businessmen. And then you've got diplomats. Who often acquire things as part of diplomatic negotiations with other countries, and those countries tend to view things as the material remains of their past, whether they feel that they're culturally connected to that past or disconnected from that past. If it's modern Muslim Egyptians and we're looking at things from the Pharaonic age from 3,000 years ago, that's a perception of cultural discontinuity. Whereas with the Chinese, they might have a perception of cultural continuity. Regardless, they will often make the following calculation. It's more valuable to me to have positive relations with a powerful Western empire who can help me out in various ways than it is to retain crumbling pagan marble from 2,000 years ago that most of my population and me does not identify with in any meaningful way whatsoever. And the Elgin marbles are a great example of that.
Welcome back to the MO Podcast. My name is Jonathan Neal. I'm here with my co-host, Joey Flores. And today we are very pleased to welcome Professor Justin Jacobs to the podcast to discuss his most recent book called Plunder, How Museums Got Their Treasures. Professor Jacobs is a professor of history at American University in Washington, D.C., and a specialist originally on the modern history of China, and also what I would call the history of archaeological adventurism. His early research focused on the region of Xinjiang, a key case study for understanding China's uneasy transition from imperialism to nationalism. And one can only presume that with the heavy lift of his first book and tenure out of the way, Jacobs was able to turn his attention to his true interests, which brought us his second book titled Indiana Jones in History, a very entertaining and informative look at the question that has continued to occupy Jacobs for much of the last decade, which is what is the real story behind the adventures of archaeologists who are responsible for uncovering so much of what we know about the history of the world and which we now see in its museums. He continued that line of inquiry with his penultimate book so far, The Compensation of Plunder, How China Lost Its Treasures, which was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2020. And now with Plunder, How Museums Got Their Treasures, which was published just this year by Reaction Books. We get to talk about that and so many more things today. Professor Jacobs, Justin, thank you for joining us on the MO Podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
So we're going to get into questions about your most recent book in just a moment. But first, a very important question. Why do you insist on denying that the Indiana Jones movies are just fictions made up by George Lucas and Steven Spielberg and not the masterpieces of documentary filmmaking that we all know that they really are?
So I've looked into this question, and as part of my research, I definitely wanted to uncover what was going on, what went into the films, because like I think a lot of people do growing up, I just sort of made the naive assumption that this must be based on history, they must have done some research, and there must be a real Indiana Jones in history. And you go online and you'll actually find websites dedicated to actually showing people who are confident that they know who the historical Indiana Jones was. And they'll even have images and photographs of people who kind of seem to cut the right pose and whatnot. Well, the real gold mine, the real historical gold mine is that in the 2000s, when the fourth film came out, it was leaked onto the internet, a transcript over 100 pages, a transcript of a brainstorming session that George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, and Larry Kasdan had organized over several days in Los Angeles in 1978, 3 years before the first film, Raiders of the Lost Ark came out in 1981. When you read through the transcript, it's a fascinating window into what they were thinking at this time period, what influences were going to go into this character. And I went through with a fine-toothed comb, and the most astounding observation that I was able to make, the very first thing that leaped out, is that in over 100 pages of this transcription of a brainstorming session, not once was the name of a real-life historical archaeologist ever mentioned. Not once. Which seems to suggest to me that there isn't a lot of historical research that actually went into the creation of this character. Instead, you see them talking about previous Hollywood productions over and over and over again. James Bond, Ripley's Believe It or Not. It should be like a Disney theme park ride. All sorts of things from popular culture is what they're drawing on, and they're recycling them to create a new fascinating character. But they weren't historians. I don't fault them for that. I think it's on us that we've made the naive assumption that this must be based on history, and it's simply not.
Amazing. I love this idea of the Indiana Jones movie as a kind of postmodern pastiche of other pop culture references that then just happen to take its place within the pantheon of great Hollywood history. Well, let's get to the more sort of, I'd say, pressing topic, or the more sort of current topic for you, which is the publication of this, I think, a very interesting book and very timely book, about the idea, I would say, of plunder and the sort of the question of cultural property and what these various different artifacts and objects are doing in our museums. And I think there'll be ample time for you to talk a little bit more about the origin stories of the book. I'm very interested to hear more about its origins in some of your earlier research, particularly with regards to China, because I think that kind of historical comparison and cross-cultural comparison to Western institutions and Western cultures is a very interesting one. But just to get to the meat of it right off the top, the book sort of suggests that a lot of the narratives of plunder and theft regarding museum artifacts that are coming down to us today are rather, let's say, oversimplified. And so I'm sort of curious, from your standpoint, how does this current conversation around restitution, cultural heritage, what is it getting wrong? And what are these debates? How do they reflect kind of shifts in our contemporary moral thinking about art and artifacts and the roles that museums play? Big question, but I figure it's the heart of the book.
That goes right to the heart of the matter. To put it very simply and straightforward, what we get wrong is that we don't understand the original historical context in which the transaction was made, in which artifacts from other countries were transported across these boundaries into Western museums. What we do instead, most of us not being historians who research, go into archives and look at all the, historical materials to reconstruct what was actually going on. What we do instead is we project our own values today back in time. And we simply assume, sort of like I naively assume that there was actual historical research behind the Indiana Jones film franchise. We all pretty much just assume that the way that we think of these artifacts today must have been how our ancestors thought of them as well. And then, so today we view them as priceless artifacts that represent various nations in the world, and that these things should be preserved, held in museums by the descendants of the nations that they represent. And in short, what we're missing when we don't understand the original historical context is that 100 years ago, 200 years ago, the people in the source countries from where these artifacts were transported did not think in terms of the nation, that these are emblems of the nation and therefore priceless. They thought of them in other terms. They had a different valuation at the time period. And so in short, the answer that all these things were able to be removed was not because Westerners in general went in with guns. That happened a few times with military plunder, but that's the exception. Most of the time, they were able to get enthusiastic and voluntary cooperation from all sectors of society in the source country because they provided something, a form of compensation to the locals that was perceived by them at that time and place, according to their value system, as more valuable than the artifact that was being removed. And then over time, the people in the source country begin to become more Western educated, and they then subscribe to Western values and the Western valuation of this as a priceless artifact of a nation. And once that happens, they begin to say, well, wait a second. If we now think that this is priceless today, why did our ancestors let it go? And because most people don't go back and recover the original historical context and understand the changing valuation of these artifacts over time, they simply assume that our ancestors, the Chinese 100 years ago or whatnot, must have been corrupt. It must have been imperialist coercion. There must have been deceit involved at some point because who would betray their nation unless they were coerced into doing so or they were traitors. And that is based on our view today that all this stuff represents nations and is therefore priceless. But that's not how it was viewed in the past. It had a different, lower valuation in the eyes of people in the source country, and they were happy to let it go in exchange for a form of compensation that we've now forgotten about, that was tendered at the time.
It's something that you just said sort of got me thinking. There's a kind of curious irony maybe that the sort of in the current moment, the attitudes of towards cultural property on the part of many nations has, in the way that you just described it, sort of adopted the Western nationalist attitude of the objects and the items that are part of these regions' histories, somehow representing the people or representing the nation or having some authentic or intrinsic attachment to some sort of deep history of the land and the people for these various different places. But it's funny because so much of the critique of the let's say the traffic in cultural property, is condemned from the standpoint, let's say, of the colonial lens, right? The sort of like without the sort of colonial imperialism in place, then the terms by which these objects and this work was transacted or exchanged or gifted would have been very different. But it seems to me that it is the either the last gasp or the apotheosis of this kind of colonial project that all of these other countries or regions now have adopted the kind of nationalist attitude, which was largely a kind of export of that imperial program of the 18th and 19th century, that now the sort of reclamation of the cultural property itself could be seen, as just part and parcel or an extension of that colonial history that so much of the current critique kind of bases itself on or looks to try and extend. Is that a sort of a fair characterization or an irony that's taking place, or do you view it a little bit differently?
That's actually a very good characterization. There is a great irony here, is that what essentially happened is that the Westerners were the ones who first got the idea that these things were not simply, exclusive emblems of the usually wealthy, educated elites who hoarded them, that they were symbols of nations, that they were symbols of nations. They sowed the seeds of their own demise, of the future resistance. They're the ones who came and projected a nationalist evaluation onto these things. This now is not simply a ancient bronze vessel that reflects on the taste and connoisseurship of its Chinese owner. This is now a symbol of the Chinese nation, and therefore it's priceless. Now, there was an imperialist context to this, absolutely. What the Westerners were saying 100, 200 years ago is that this symbolizes the Chinese nation, or the Peruvian nation or the Egyptian nation, and we're the best sponsors of that nation. We're going to help you sort of revive your ancient glory. You can see the monuments all around you. Your ancestors used to be wonderful and glorious. You've stagnated since. There was a pejorative discourse about this, and we're the best qualified people in the modern world to be the stewards of your revival. All right, so they're the ones who brought that idea. It had a clear imperialist context with a lot of ugly racism and whatnot in there, but it also planted the seeds of the future resistance against the Westerners, because then when people in the source country begin to be Westernized, go to Western universities, get a Western education, subscribe to Western ideas, they will start building their own museums that are just like Western museums. They'll have their own archaeologists, and they will internalize the idea that these things truly are symbols of our nation, and that they're priceless. But in an anti-imperialist context, now it should be a symbol of an independent, autonomous Chinese nation, in which these Westerners play no part. So yeah, there is a great deal of irony here, in which the Westerners plant the seeds of their own demise eventually, in the whole antiquity transfer process.
Justin, was there a specific story or a specific object or a narrative about something that you had seen, which once you dug in a little bit, you felt like it was just wrong? And ultimately, was there one or two of these narratives that drove you to, have such a deep interest in this and ultimately put out, these books about it? Were there things where the common narrative was, oh, this was stolen, or this was plundered, and you saw it, you did a little research and said that's ludicrous, absolutely not, and and that drove you into this field of research more?
Yes, absolutely. I'll talk about a series of artifacts that are probably less well known, and then there's also a very famous case that I then applied my lens later on to. So I started off in Chinese history. That's my original training, with Chinese language, and I thought I'm going to look at Chinese reactions to Western archaeologists who went to China. There was a series of pretty, well-known expeditions, archaeological expeditions by various European scholars that went to the northwestern desert region of Xinjiang in the first couple decades of the 20th century. Now, I was already familiar with this area because of my original political research on how the Chinese managed to retain this mostly Uyghur-speaking Muslim area of China in the 20th century. There was no archaeological aspect to that research, but I was familiar with the area. So now I thought, okay, I'm going to look at this exact same area, but now I'm going to try to find Chinese reactions to what they're doing. What did they think? The most famous artifacts that have ever come out of the northwestern deserts of China are from what are known as the Mogao grottos, which are a series of about 500 caves that were built and decorated in Buddhist and Taoist motifs and other sorts of art from all over Central and South Asia from about 400 AD to 1400 AD or so, about 1,000 years. It's often referred to as the art gallery in the desert. And it's just outside the oasis of Dunhuang. And in the Mogao grottos, there was one cave, now known as Cave 17. We often refer to it as a secret cave library that was rediscovered by a largely illiterate Taoist monk in 1900. Nice round year, 1900. He broke through some plaster on one of the walls and discovered a hidden niche that was filled to the brim with over 40,000 ancient manuscripts and other paintings and whatnot that dated largely to about 1,000 years ago, and no moisture whatsoever. They've been sitting in here for 900 years. It's absolutely incredible. And so these manuscripts were discovered by this Taoist priest, and then he began to treat these manuscripts in a way that made me realize that no one at the time regarded their removal as theft. It was these manuscripts from Dunhuang, often just referred to as the Dunhuang manuscripts. I was able to trace how Chinese interacted with them at all levels of society. Did they regard these as emblems of the Chinese nation? How did they see them? And what I found is that they traded them around like they were private property. They felt free to add their own sort of what are known as colophons, where they add a little commentary on the end of the manuscript. These are 1,000-year-old manuscripts, and they feel free to just write on them. This is what I think of as such a beautiful calligraphy. These sorts of things, and they would reveal things in these colophons that demonstrated how they treated this as private property. They would say things like, I got hold of this manuscript because the garrison commander held a banquet and he gave it to me as a gift. And you realize that they're trading these around as forms of social and political capital to sort of recruit officials to be, in their, alliance within the government, to get people on your good side. And then they would act in the exact same way towards the foreigners. They would give them gifts of these manuscripts. It revealed a whole different way of interacting with material remains of the past. They did not see these ever as emblems of the Chinese nation that should be quarantined, sterilized on a pedestal behind a glass container, and its sort of natural life cycle is over. They saw these as sort of living documents of history that they owned, and they were able to insert themselves into it. And if a foreigner comes along and shows appreciation for this as a scholar and wants to study it, they saw it as a suitable gift that they could give to them as well. So the Dunhuang manuscripts are really my first major case study to show that the Chinese did not view these in the way that we view them today. They viewed them as, commodities that you could trade around, that you could interact with in ways that we would never dream of. We would refer to this stuff as graffiti, colophones as graffiti. We would say that these things were being vandalized if we interacted with these things in that way. So that was the first case study that really made me realize they're not calling them thieves. They're actually giving them manuscripts as gifts and then praising them for the scholarship that they do on these manuscripts. They're not saying, hey, you stole this from the Chinese nation. The other very famous, much more famous case study that many people have heard of are the Elgin marbles. The Elgin marbles. The Elgin marbles are usually held up. Oftentimes, you'll see descriptions of it that is in the form of plunder taken away.
This is the one that was on the Jon Stewart last week tonight, right?
The John Oliver.
I mean, John
John,
Oliver. I'm sorry, John Oliver. Yes.
he was actually talking about the Ben and Bronzes. That was
Yeah.
Okay. My bad.
the Dan Hicks book on Ben and Bronzes. And for what it's worth, if you want to talk about military plunder, in my book, when I identify the 4 different types of ways in which things got into Western museums, military plunder by soldiers is one of them. The Ben and Bronzes is an example of that. And that has a pretty good case for restitution today. I don't deny that. But I also point out that it was a pretty rare form of artifact transfer and not the norm. And it's a mistake to take that as representative of how everything got into a museum, as if an entire museum is a crime scene. Things that were acquired by military plunder are in the minority. The Elgin marbles is it's one of those things that often gets sort of mixed in together with things that are unambiguously military plunder, like the Ben and Bronzes. But if you look at the original historical circumstances, the way that I looked at this is that it seemed to me to be a classic case of a diplomatic gift. In my book, I talk about the 4 ways in which things end up in Western museums. You've got soldiers who engage in military plunder. You've got scholars who do excavations and expeditions. You have dealers who are businessmen. And then you've got diplomats. Who often acquire things as part of diplomatic negotiations with other countries, and those countries tend to view things as the material remains of their past, whether they feel that they're culturally connected to that past or disconnected from that past. If it's modern Muslim Egyptians and we're looking at things from the Pharaonic age from 3,000 years ago, that's a perception of cultural discontinuity. Whereas with the Chinese, they might have a perception of cultural continuity. Regardless, they will often make the following calculation. It's more valuable to me to have positive relations with a powerful Western empire who can help me out in various ways than it is to retain crumbling pagan marble from 2,000 years ago that most of my population and me does not identify with in any meaningful way whatsoever. And the Elgin marbles are a great example of that, in which you have the Sultan, they're part of the Ottoman Empire at that time period. You have to recover the entire context. The context of that is that Napoleon had invaded Egypt in 1798, hoping to cut off British access to India through the Red Sea. Back then, they still went over the Sinai Peninsula, and they, to get to India, that was the quickest way to get to India if you were British. And Napoleon wanted to cut that off. The British, for their own selfish reasons, want to kick Napoleon out of Egypt, and the Sultan in Constantinople, Egypt is a province of the Ottoman Empire. He wants it back, but he doesn't have the military means to defeat Napoleon. So Lord Elgin is appointed ambassador to Constantinople, the first permanent British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, and he's showered with gifts all the time. And one of the gifts that he gets for British help in kicking the French out of Egypt and returning Egypt back to the Sultan is the firman, the document that tells local officials to do whatever he wants you to do. And eventually this results in the metopes, the friezes, and the pediments, known as the Parthenon marbles, being removed by his men in Athens, essentially as a diplomatic gift. Thanks for the British help in kicking Napoleon out of there. So the true cost, the true value of the Elgin marbles, as it was perceived at the time, from the eyes of the people who were there, was that they were getting Egypt in return. That was the value. If the Elgin marbles, if the Parthenon marbles do not exceed the value of getting Egypt back, they're going to do that. They're going to take that deal. That's the way that I think about this. What is the perception at the time of the value of this in the eyes of those in charge and in the eyes of people lower down on this socioeconomic spectrum? So you have to identify each level of engagement, who's engaging people like Lord Elgin, and what their motives are. And I find that, yes, the people in charge were happy to let this stuff go, but also the people down below were happy to let it go. Most Greeks were Eastern Orthodox Christians. Only 50% of the city of Athens was inhabited by Greeks at the time period. Most people there were not thinking in terms of the Greek nation. That was not their primary identity, and did not identify with the Parthenon marbles in any meaningful way at the time. That's why he encounters almost no resistance whatsoever. So I see that as a classic case of a diplomatic gift, certainly not military plunder. It was the opposite of military plunder. The British were the military ally of the Ottomans, and the Elgin marbles were a symbol of the Sultan's gratitude for that military alliance.
There's a really interesting image that you reproduce in the book, a watercolor from I think the very first years of the 19th century that shows it's kind of an ostensible record of the removal of the metopes of the Parthenon. And I think, if the cliche as a picture is worth 1,000 words is what's kind of fascinating is like the total disrepair of the Parthenon in that image, right? I mean, you basically have sort of two flanks of the architecture, of the outside columns, but importantly, there's other structures that have been built on the side to kind of hold up the corner, and there is a mosque that has been built on the site of the Parthenon in the background. And so it hardly has the kind of grandeur that one would think of or as today, or as a or at least at the beginning of the 19th century. It would be it's a difficult case to make, although I know that many people make it nonetheless. As august a kind of critic as someone like Christopher Hitchens has made the arguments about the restitution of the Parthenon marbles. But that picture really kind of hammered it home. I was like, at the moment that this is happening, there is no love for this material, right? Like there is no idea of this site being a sanctified place for ancient Greek culture, because it has also been adapted and adopted by the Islamic religion, and the site is in total disarray. And just you can sort of see what the conditions are. And so one can imagine if Elgin and his crew come in with some interest in these things for transition to the British Museum, it's like, hey, that's an easy trade to make in exchange for a military alliance.
Yeah, I teach a course at my university. I'm teaching it right now this semester, History of Archaeological Expeditions, and we had our first exam yesterday. You would have gotten an A on one of the questions. One of the things that I had my students do is I actually reproduced that exact same watercolor by Edward Dodwell. I think it's from 1801 or 2. And I asked them to deconstruct this image. We spent a great time in class looking at that image, and you actually got all the points that I brought out in class as well. That, yes, I mean, it's done. You can see that's a wonderful image. It's done in broad daylight, all right, in the single most conspicuous part of all of Athens, right on top of the Acropolis, the high hill. No one involved in this feels like they're doing something that's wrong, or that they have to do it, at night, clandestinely, or anything like that. You've got people from multiple different socioeconomic segments of society. You've got the Westerners who are directing the work. You've got Ottoman officials sitting on the ground, and they're clearly okay with what's going on here. And you have lower class laborers who are helping remove this stuff as well. As you point out, the building is in ruins, hasn't been tended for millennia, and you've got a mosque, a symbol of a different cultural orientation that we often whitewash and forget about. The entire Parthenon was originally a mosque and a Christian church before that, and then it was blown up by the Venetians in 1687 during a siege of Athens, and they built a much smaller mosque within the ruins. Once again, there's that irony we were talking about of Westerners planting the seeds of their own demise. The idea of the Greek nation, says something that should be premised on ancient Greek to revive the modern Greek nation, is something that Western Europeans also brought into Greece. No one in Greece was thinking in this terms when Elgin removed the marbles. It was romantics like Lord Byron, the guy who gets very famous poem that critiques Lord Elgin and actually goes to Greece to fight in the War of Independence in the 1820s. A couple decades later, they're the ones who sort of bring the idea of these romantic notions of ancient Greece as the basis of the identity of modern Greece into Greece. And then the Greeks internalize that and begin to use it against the Westerners and clamor for the return of the Elgin marbles as a symbol of something that it was not seen as a symbol by any of the people who lived in the source country or the source empire at the time that it was removed.
So is there an argument, though, sort of at this point, even just for the fact of like, okay, we know that the Greeks have put a lot of time and attention now into their national history, their national culture, the history of their people. It is the source code of Western civilization to a certain extent. And they would like to have these things back in the place from which they came. And we know that this is the place from which they came. Even just at its like most sort of basic sensibility. Are you in favor of the restitution of these marbles, regardless of whether there's any sort of admission or declaration of it was wrong to have taken them, or regardless of what the arguments are around it? But do you see, or do you agree with the idea at this point in let's say contemporary life, contemporary politics, that the that the continued stewardship of these things by the British Museum is becoming a little untenuous for the argument saying like, oh, well, we're the best stewards of it and this is a great place and it's, we'll just continue to keep hold of it for you. And, maybe some point in the future we'll go back.
Yeah, so the argument I think that you would make if you wanted to pursue that line of thinking is essentially that at the time that the Westerners took this, they were using it in political ways as well. It wasn't all just, politically disinterested science and cultural inquiry and whatnot. They clearly, the British Museum was an emblem of the British Empire, and they were proud of it. And it was used to show that we're the best stewards of all the world's art. And everything should go into our museum. That was clearly politicized as one part of its identity for a very long time. In ways that we now find fairly odious and condescending. And you could make the argument then that if that was one part of the Elgin Marbles, a big part of the Elgin Marbles identity was to be politicized in favor, in support of the British Empire at the time, then what's wrong with recognizing that, okay, the Greeks may not have seen it like this at the time, but now the Greeks subscribe to the exact same kind of idea about priceless nations and whatnot, and this being an emblem of it, and they'd like to politicize it as well. It would be useful in helping them. They were not one of the sort of main beneficiaries of Western imperialism at its height over the last couple hundred years. So it's almost like an act of charity in that sense. Now, that's fine. I don't have any problem if people decide that that's what they want to do. As a historian, though, I just want, if I have any say in this at all, which I won't, it would simply be to make sure we understand exactly why we're doing it. I think it's useful to be honest with ourselves and honestly represent it as an act of charity of some sort, that if you reconstruct the original historical context, there's really nothing immoral at the time. No, or at least you can say no one at the time thought this was immoral, according to their own standards, not our standards. As long as you recognize that, and that if it's being returned today, it's being returned for very different reasons, not because this was a moral act. I'm fine with that if that's what people decide. The British will be getting something out of it in the same way that the Sultan got something out of it. If they ever decide to do this, they will also be getting something like diplomatic capital in return. It's not just going to be pure charity. They're going to want to do it in a way that recognizes that they get something in return that's useful to them. I don't know what that would be, but it'll be something.
Sure. Justin, these two major examples that you cited, was there a strong existing narrative that was contrary to your findings when you embarked on learning more about these? Were people saying something else?
Essentially, the mainstream discourse that we hear, and pretty much for all artifacts that were taken anywhere throughout the world today, is that these were the results of three things. They were results of imperialist coercion, actual force, imperialist deceit. They were being, actively deceptive, and the locals simply didn't know what was going on, or corruption. If they ever acknowledge that people in the source country may be to blame, usually they chalk it up to nationalist traitors or venal corrupt officials who are only looking after their own interests. That's usually the three things that you see pointed out in discourses about how these things left their country, because that's really the only rhetorical option for politicians today, or people who think in a nationalist mode, nation first. You kind of have to come to that conclusion if you don't know your history. If you don't realize what the original context was, and you're only thinking in nationalist mode, as most of us are brought up to believe, right? We all go to school and we're all taught to Pledge of Allegiance, the abstract eternal nation in our mind that your primary identity is supposed to be. If you're thinking in those terms and you're not a historian, you are just going to naively assume that your ancestors thought that way as well. And if they thought that way as well, and these things were priceless emblems of the nation, then anyone who engaged the Westerners and helped them remove it must have been corrupt, they must have been deceived, or they must have done it at the barrel of an imperialist gun. Because you can't really conceive of any other way for someone to let priceless treasures that symbolize your eternal nation, the most important part of your identity, our politicians tell us, you can't conceive of any other way that it could have left the country that you live in. So that is the mainstream discourse, and that's what I started off with. And the moment I went back, and I needed to recover voices of the voiceless, people who we hadn't heard previously. And so really, the thing that I've always used as my anchor, my empirical anchor, was when I first got to Oxford, and I found, and I was wading through Orlstein, the British archaeologist Orlstein's archives. I went there to look at his field diaries, and I was kind of hoping to get the voice of the voiceless indirectly. All right, does he ever quote or summarize the opinions or things that his laborers say? or he meets a Chinese official. Does he summarize what the Chinese official told him? Then I have to account for biases, control for this sort of stuff, imperialist condescension, but I'll still recover some nugget of a native voice. But when I unexpectedly found a box in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, a box labeled Chinese Docs. It was box 341 and 342. I opened it up, said, oh my God, it was filled with over 100 documents, all in Chinese. And eventually I was able to find something like 10 to 15 Chinese language letters that were from officials, writing to Stein, telling him in their own language, unmediated, what they thought of him. And then I thought, oh my God, this is a gold mine. I have the voice of the natives, undiluted, unmediated by imperialist condescension, patriarchal kind of, patronizing and whatnot. And that has always been the anchor for me. When I saw that began everything. And I thought, we cannot assume that anyone, non-Western person in the 18th or 19th century thought that the way we do today, because I was blown away. I mean, you got to see these letters. I put excerpts of it in the 3rd chapter of my book. I mean, it's just so much praise. They love these archaeologists. It's not simply they're indifferent or they don't really talk about it. They talk about it explicitly. They mention, I saw what you're taking away. They know they're taking it away, and they have extreme praise for how great of an archaeologist you are, how you're contributing to the history of China by studying this stuff and putting it on display. I love the books that you've written in which you analyze this. On and on and on. It's very explicit what they're praising.
I want you to continue this line of thought, because one of the questions I had was, how has your interest and expertise in China in particular helped to frame this larger question about challenges of cultural property and cultural patrimony that I think is kind of lost when the examples are largely the Middle East, North Africa, West Africa, where the history of colonial adventurism is much more easily framed in terms of a serious power imbalance or a power dynamic that is far more exploitative. Whereas, at least with the little that I know, the traffic with East Asia, China in particular, a 5,000-year history of empire and of learning and of culture, and in many cases advancements beyond what the West had been able to achieve at certain points in time. How is that example, the example of China, helped to frame your positions on this issue?
That's an excellent question, and it's so important. I'm so fortunate that it just happened to be that my area of expertise was China. And that's where my case studies were going to come from, because I didn't necessarily set out to make my career around this. As I began with political history, Chinese control of Uyghurs and whatnot. And it was so fortunate that the Chinese case study was my bread and butter, where I was able to go into the Chinese source base, because as you said, there's something very special and unique about the situation in China with regard to their relationship to the material remains of their history, their past, that you don't see anywhere else. In short, the Chinese are the only people other than Westerners who regarded the material remains of their past with a perception of cultural continuity. I was alluding to that a little bit earlier before. Everywhere else in the world where the Westerners go, they encounter people who adopt a perception of cultural discontinuity, usually. All right, the things that are being removed are thousands of years ago, and for all intents and purposes, it's usually forgotten who the ancestors even were. It may have been a totally different people. In China alone, you get a case where not only do all the educated elites identify with everything that is found in the soil or found from tombs or in their own private collections, they're studying it, they cherish it. And yet, even in this situation, you see the outflow of antiquities. I mean, the Chinese antiquities are probably one of the most common things you see at any major Western museum. I mean, every major Western museum has a whole hall devoted to Chinese antiquities. So one of the most common things to be transported across borders into Western museums actually came from a place where you can't say that there was no one in the country who didn't value this stuff. They valued it immensely, but they did not see it as priceless emblems of the Chinese nation. They saw it, usually the educated elites saw it as precious cultural artifacts. So what this means is that simply, it's not that they're not willing to let it go, because it's not priceless. They trade it and exchange it among themselves as very precious items, right? What it means is that the compensation they expect in return is simply higher than in other parts of the world because they value it more. But they still believe in the sanctity of private property. They still believe in finders keepers. If Orlstein goes into China, hires his own men, pays for his own expedition, whatever his men find, everyone there agrees this belongs to you. I found this wonderful Chinese phrase from the first decade of the 20th century in which a Chinese official was commenting. He says, many things have come out from over 1,500 years old from the soils of the Taklamakan Desert in northwestern China. And he says, most of them have been taken away by Westerners. He doesn't criminalize that. He doesn't pass judgment on it. He just says most of them have been taken away by Westerners. And then his next line is wonderful. He says in Chinese, but di bu ai bao. That means the earth does not love its treasures. That was the phrase that he uses to basically say the Westerners have gotten a head start. They found some really good stuff from the soil, but he doesn't criminalize it. He doesn't believe that this stuff belongs to the Chinese nation, that the soil is Chinese and whatever you find belongs to the Chinese nation before you even find it. They're saying the earth doesn't love its treasures. Things will emerge. Whoever finds them, it's theirs. Whether you're Chinese, whether you're British, whether you're French, it doesn't matter. So what's so important to reiterate about the Chinese case study is that you cannot simply say the locals didn't care. Sure, the illiterate poor peasants, both Chinese and Muslim, they didn't really care. But the educated classes, the Confucian officials, they're highly educated. They have more money. Their wealth portfolio is much larger than any Western scholar. So you can't they're just bribed, for money and whatnot. No, these people were wealthier than the scholars who visited them. And yet even here, you see an enormous amount of antiquities that were taken out with not behind the barrel of a gun. There's really only two major instances of military plunder in Chinese history, 1860 in the Old Summer Palace in Beijing, and 1900 in the Forbidden City. Now, that's military plunder. It was criticized at the time by Western pundits back home. Why are we acting like barbarians? And those things, yeah, they got a pretty good case for restitution. But those are the outliers. Those are the anomalies. The vast majority of stuff was taken out peacefully with the knowledge and support and cooperation of the Chinese, who also cherished it.
When does that attitude towards property begin to shift in China specifically? How does it, I know that you talk a little bit about some laws that change in the first couple of decades of the 20th century. What changes and what is precipitating the sort of attitudinal change towards this cultural property at the time?
Great question. And it's a major shift that you see throughout the world. What I've been able to find, you keep thinking, okay, if that's how things were seen in its original context, and we now understand why things are removed, how do we get to the point where suddenly, Western scholars are seen as criminals and you're not allowed to do unilateral excavations anymore without the cooperation and support and involvement of the locals? Essentially, World War I is the turning point. What you find after World War I is that most of two things happen. Either non-Western empires are dismembered as a result, like the Ottoman Empire loses, they're on the losing side of the war and they're dismembered. And afterwards, you've got a lot of independent countries that are suddenly looking for a new identity. All right, places like Egypt, places like Turkey. And they're saying, what are we going to construct our new modern national identity on? They feel very much burned by the Western empires, but they've got many people in their government themselves are Westernized. All right, if you look at the people who are ruling these countries at the time, they all, most of them studied abroad in European and American universities. They often, are fluent in French or English, and they subscribe to Western ideals. But now, in the wake of the First World War, they're grasping for a new national identity that is of the West, but seems to resist the West. And so what you'll see, like throughout the Middle East and in Northern Africa, you'll find that the new elites will choose ancient sites that most of the population does not identify with. All right, but the Westernized elites do. They want to be seen as modern and Western, but also anti-imperialist. So, for example, in Egypt, the new rulers will constantly valorize the ancient pharaohs. You'll have rulers like Hosni Mubarak putting up billboards with his face right next to the face of Tutankhamun, right? And then in Iran, you'll see this ancient site, the Achaemenid site, pre-Islamic site of Persepolis. In Afghanistan, it'll be the Buddhist site of Bamiyan. In Syria, it'll be the pre-Islamic site of Palmyra. I have so many examples, on and on and on. And you get this weird tension in which the new westernized rulers now see these as priceless emblems of the nations that they wish to create in a Western image, but not any longer under Western tutelage. And that's at odds with most of their population, which say, hey, what about the Islamic past, which is being ignored? And so, for instance, when the Egyptian president Anwar Sadat was assassinated in 1981, you know what his assassin said? He said, I have killed Pharaoh, seeing that as an emblem of someone who is not identifying with the right form of their past. When ISIS takes over Palmyra in Syria, they destroy the site of Palmyra as an emblem of our leaders adhering slavishly to Western models of what the appropriate past is. So that tension still exists throughout the Middle East between the westernized elites who don't like to admit they're westernized, but they still pursue that same agenda, versus the population, which is still saying, hey, what about we identify with Islam? That shift largely occurs with World War I throughout most of the countries of the Middle East. All right. In China, World War I is also the turning point for slightly different reasons. They're on the right side of the war. But they still feel like they got the shaft. Afterwards, both Japan and China supported the winning side. They didn't contribute troops, but they had logistical support. And afterwards, China thought that with the defeat of Germany, the German concessions in China would be handed back to China because they're on the winning side. But Japan was also on the winning side, and the Westerners wanted to please Japan, so they gave the German concessions to the Japanese. So the Chinese, even though they're on the winning side, they still feel like they're in the same situation as the people in the Middle East, that we got the wrong end of the deal. The Westerners are wronging us. We can't slavishly just continue to think we modernize along Western lines and everything's going to be okay and they're going to treat us like one of them. But you want to be one of them, but now you have this anti-imperialist resistance aspect to it. So in China in the 1920s, that's when you get the criminalization discourse. That's when you get it everywhere. Howard Carter discovers the tomb of Tutankhamun in November 1922. If he had found it 5 years earlier, those artifacts would be in the Met and the British Museum. At least half of them would be. He found it after they have their independence, and they're looking for a new identity that's anti-imperialist. So it's the 100% of them are in the National Museum in Cairo. And the Chinese begin also to adopt the discourse of criminalization, saying you're a thief, you took this stuff immorally, and now these things have to remain with us. This whole transition period is from the 1910s to the 1920s. That's when we get to of our current ideas about where these things should go.
Yeah, and I guess maybe there's a silver lining in that, because we wouldn't have, even though it took 50 years, we wouldn't have had the King Tut mania of the 1970s and Steve Martin and everybody else doing their bits. I remember that as a child.
Yeah.
Super fascinating. I wanted to ask as well. So going back just briefly to this question of the Duang manuscripts, in the West broadly, I think probably now even more so, there's sort of like two ways of thinking about, or two ways of valuing what these objects might have been. Especially when it comes to the way that museums think about it. One is like artifacts having to do with the sort of the age and the specific sort of material links that they have to a place or a people or a culture, right? I mean, there's something kind of, there's a sort of physical embodiment or manifestation of a certain moment, a certain thing. And then, broadly speaking, there's also then something about a sort of aesthetic category, right? There's something about like the way the thing looks, its appearance, it's particularly like beautiful example of X, Y, and Z. What was the primary value that the Chinese were placing on the manuscripts as tokens of gift exchange? Because it occurs to me that if you were valuing highly the sort of material object itself, you'd be more reluctant to add your own colophon or to embellish or to engage or to transform what the thing is. But it doesn't seem like but it does seem like there was a significant amount of value placed on the age or the sort of relationship this thing had to the past. And so I'm curious, sort of, what is the sort of valuation on the part of the people who traded these things? And this is a more sort of specific way that I want to get to in the larger question about how dealers in general have played a big role in the transaction of these cultural artifacts, which I think your book does a great job of bringing to the fore. But first, what is actually, what are the Chinese actually saying about these manuscripts that make them of particular import to them and worthy of exchange with one another?
Yeah, that's something I've gone into great depth with, to reading the colophons, which are really hard to read. They're written in
I bet.
cursive Chinese script and whatnot, and these are highly educated people, so they're not using everyday Chinese either. But regardless, once I got through, many years of looking at these and everything, you find that it's remarkable, the diversity of things that they say about them. One of the ones that I found that was most amusing, or just kind of funny, is that oftentimes the Chinese officials attributed a spiritual value to them. If they had an ancient Buddha sutra that was over 1,000 years old, they would say things like, the fact that this thing survived for 1,000 years intact, like it was written yesterday, shows that it has the Buddha's blessing. There's something, almost supernatural about this, and they would treat them as almost like sacred talismans sometimes. There was this one wonderful example where a guy is writing a colophon. He owns one of these manuscripts, and he says, "Today I went out and I went hunting and I killed a wild turkey." And he goes back, and later that night he says, "I killed a wild turkey today while I went out hunting." And then he says, "But I opened up this manuscript and I read the Buddha Sutra for a while. Perhaps it'll help me atone for today's sort of bad karma that I incurred by killing this turkey." And I remember reading that. I was like, wow, this is just precious. The way that he's interacting with this, he is attributing it's almost like a sacred talisman to him. But then for, that's more of an outlier. The vast majority of people who are interacting with these simply see them as forms of social and political capital. These are gifts that you give to your friends, to your superiors, your bosses, to ingratiate yourself with them, but to ingratiate yourself with them in a very particular way. It's not just anything. You don't give cash. Gentlemen don't give cash, and you'll be accused of bribery. So cash is, off the table. But you want to show that you have good taste. Not only that you have good taste, that you can appreciate something like this, that someone gifted it to you, or you went into the market and you bought it. So it shows that you value these wonderful emblems of the past. It then in turn shows that you think that the person you're giving it to is also similarly worthy, that they too are educated enough and erudite enough that they will take the time to read a Buddha sutra from 1,500 years ago and decipher the calligraphy and be able, to appraise the calligraphy. So many of the colophons where this is a classic example of the seal script from the Song dynasty. Look how this stroke goes this way and this stroke, And so when you give it to someone, it's expected that they're going to engage in that sort of analysis, and you are flattering them, you're complimenting them. I appreciate this enough, and I appreciate that you will appreciate this in the proper way that an educated gentleman would do. So I term this social and political capital as the way that they're viewing these manuscripts, but they are absolutely alienable commodities that they can move around and interact with in whatever the way that they want, because again, I sound like a broken record. They're not seeing them as priceless emblems of the nation that have to be quarantined and sterilized, and the natural life cycle of this object is over, and it has to have a placard that gives a definitive explanation of what it means to us today. It means to them whatever they want it to mean. It's going to help me get good karma for killing a turkey. It's going to help me ingratiate myself with my boss, whatever. And so sometimes in the end, when they were in destitute straits, they sold them, which is why there is a market for Dunhuang manuscripts in Hong Kong. They still go up for auction sometimes, in which these things emerge from families that held them for a long time. And then someone finally, they come on hard times. And even though your grandpa said you should never sell this, well, I need to sell it to make some money. So they sold it, and it ends up on the market, and anyone can buy it.
It's interesting. It does seem to frame this kind of the distinction between the kind of the figure of the dealer, right, which you go into some depth about as like this, an important and very knowledgeable character in a number of these stories of archaeological exchange, cultural patrimony, cultural heritage, as sometimes overlooked often, in the way that I've confronted it, often vilified as, people who are simply being motivated by market interests of one sort of another, but really are sort of central to these stories and to this history. If we're going to tell the actual history of the sort of the traffic of archaeological artifacts from one region to another. That is not just the sort of nefarious workings of the profit motive, but I think the way that you just described it also embody these other examples about how these things can be valued by different people for different reasons, and thus find, through the workings of the market and the activities of dealers, of middlemen, find willing collectors, stewards, connoisseurs, and what have you. The opposing position of that might be the museum and the scholar, for whom the object lands in a collection inside of an institution where it exists in a library or an archive, where it is really meant only to be studied in the creation of new knowledge, not in the kind of, a larger network of appreciation or collecting or embellishment, the way that these colophons have been used over time as well.
Yeah, we privilege that particular interpretation of how we should be interacting with material remains of the past. But when we do that, we do it for ostensibly noble reasons, the advancement of knowledge about humankind and history of civilization. But when we promote that as the only legitimate form of interaction with antiquities, we delegitimize anyone else's way of interacting with these and say that's not okay, when throughout history it has been okay to interact with these things in any number of ways. It's similar to, like with the Elgin marbles, to say that the only real rightful identity of this is ancient Athens during the
right.
classic era, and we're going to ignore the Christian era, which lasted for 1,000 years. We're going to ignore the Islamic era, in which it was a mosque twice. Even after it blew up, they built another mosque. We're going to ignore that, even though that lasted for about 300 to 400 years. And the only rightful one is this one. It's like, again, there's only one way to interact with antiquities. No, there's not.
Right.
And I think we do ourselves a disservice, and we don't understand truly how the dealer supply chain works when we just simply throw around terms like tomb robber and tomb raider or grave robber and whatnot, very evocative terms, but they obscure more than they reveal.
Right.
When you look into the supply, when I started looking into, all right, if I'm looking at like a famous Chinese dealer like C.T. Liu, who I examine a lot in the book, I have to think, okay, he's actually physically located in Paris and New York most of the time. How is this happening? How is this stuff getting? And you start tracking it out, you realize, oh my God, there's this enormous supply chain. And, he's got his first agent in Shanghai. Then you have officials on the train. Then you've got some sort of agent in an interior city. And then he goes into the countryside. And, it's a whole team of people doing this. You start realizing, my goodness, this supply chain involves perhaps tens, hundreds of people who are doing this very complex operation. Lots of people know what's going on. And at a certain point, I start realizing, I think I asked the question something like, at what point do we have to acknowledge that everyone in China is a traitor to China if we use our nationalist view of looking at this? Because so many people are involved in this. It's much more instructive to say, maybe there's not only one legitimate way of interacting with antiquity. So I try to promote a different term that some scholars use, subsistence diggers, to take away the stigma of what scholars will project onto people who dig in tombs in rural areas and whatnot, and acknowledge the reason that the dealer supply chain works, that it continues, and that even though archaeologists were obstructed a long time ago, the dealer network hasn't been obstructed at all. It continues, it thrives, even in places like China, because there's a lot of people who don't subscribe to the nationalist view, who want to make a living, and they think this is a good way to make a living. And if you're a poor peasant in a rural area and you find a tomb that's 1,500 years old, you're not thinking of in terms of it being an emblem of your nation. You're thinking in terms of, hey, I can make some money and get away from the tedium and the poverty of farming all day long.
How much of this moralism is, of the sort of neo-moralism of these positions, do you think has a foundation in a kind of more broadly sort of anti-capitalist critique of asymmetrical power relations, that that sees any kind of market transaction as being exploitative or not done on a level playing field, and thus even though there are multiple different ways of engaging with the sort of cultural properties we just described, from the position of certain scholars in Western institutions, there is no transaction, there is no market that is not a evidence of a kind of exploitative relationship, and thus none of this can really be justified underneath, let's say, contemporary conditions of global finance, capital, et cetera, et cetera. I don't agree with that, but I'm sort of curious of whether that's the sort of whether you see it as that's sort of one of the reigning assumptions, and everything sort of flows from that, which then makes it impossible to sort of see a more diverse, more heterogeneous set of activities actually happening.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not generally a fan of those sorts of interpretations. I guess I would say sort of the equivalent that I see if you wanted to critique my framework of the compensations of cooperation, essentially, would be to say something similar. That ultimately, the reason why these things were, there was so much cooperation in the host country was because of asymmetrical power relations, right? Because the Western empires and their agents of collection, the archaeologists or whatnot, were so wealthy. Because maybe they had the threat of the military behind them. Even if they didn't use it, everyone knew the British Empire was powerful and could beat you in a war. And so people in these poor countries that are beset by war and poverty and famine and whatnot, there was a huge asymmetrical power relation between them, and Westerners exploited that. So yes, maybe there's no blood involved, maybe there wasn't active coercion or anything like that, and maybe they even knew exactly what they were doing. There was no deceit either, but they were doing it because they were at a disadvantage and this was their only choice. And for me, that okay, I get it, but it's sort of a slippery slope where you start saying, at a certain point, that's just how society works. There's unless we're imagining that, a utopian society where everyone's equal, this is how human relations have progressed throughout history. There are always asymmetrical power relations. At what point do you have to say, and this is what I say, my position, at what point do you just have to admit, you know what, there's no guns involved. No one's being killed. They could say no if they wanted to. And they made the conscious, rational decision in their time and place to say, I want to work with them. It's in my interest to work with them. Big abstract ideas about imperialism and cultural restitution and property were not on their radar at the time period. I'm of the position as a historian that I need to respect that historical figures can make their own decisions. We're not talking about slavery here, where it's, actual coercion of human bodies and you have no choice, a barrel of a gun. These are inanimate objects. People interact with them in different ways, and they were free to make the choice of how they wanted to interact with it at that time in place. They made those choices not under duress. And I, as a historian, respect and want to reveal those choices that were made. And then we can do it. You can run with that any way you want. If people take that and want to use it in modern day political agendas, that's fine. I just want to make sure you understand the history as well as you can before you go in that direction. Joey, did you have something that you wanted to say?
Yeah, a couple of questions. I think first, this narrative that these artifacts were either coerced out of communities or stolen or is obviously helpful to the communities who want these things back, right? Even if it's not true. So I'm quite curious if you had difficulties in obtaining information about sort of the origins of these transactions and things like that from these communities who maybe deep down know that these things weren't plundered necessarily, but who might benefit from this sort of Western sort of thinking that, these things, must have been taken in some sort of nefarious way. Did you run into people who didn't want to share the true origins of these things?
I did not run into anyone who actually knew the true origins of these things. So they weren't in a position to sort of hide that. So the work of a historian usually takes place in archives. What's actually really amazing about this project is that I found archives not only in China, but also archives abroad, like the Papers of Orlstein was my biggest gold mine. That's held in the Bodleian Library. A lot of these people, it's kind of counterintuitive when you think about it. Like, I'm going to do research on China, I'm going to go to China. Well, actually, you go to China as a Chinese historian, and you're probably not going to get access to a whole lot. Most of the archives do not open up to a foreigner for most periods of history. And it's usually going to be very frustrating to go to China to do this research. And if you go to the actual communities, you might see the remains of the sites, but no one has any historical memory today about what happened 100 years ago. And the local archives usually aren't going to have anything, or if they do, they're not going to open it up to anyone, foreigner or Chinese, regardless. So I found two unexpected sources to sort of figure out where I'm going to get my data from. Foreign archives, which surprisingly would bring stuff back from China and then store it in a place that is publicly accessible today. That's where I got the first cache of Chinese letters written to Stein. Paris had letters written to the French sinologist Paul Palliot, and on and on. They bring this stuff back with them. And then this is the most amazing thing. China will usually not let you in, foreign scholars or Chinese scholars, to most archives in China. You're going to get turned away and laughed at the gate. I've been laughed at before. But then they go around and they do this amazing thing. Under their own auspices, these archives will often publish collections of their archival documents that they would never let you see in person if you showed up at the archive. Then they turn around and they publish this stuff in a compendium that libraries around the world can buy. So I'm just as amazed as anyone when you want to study Oral Stein, his 4 expeditions from 1900 to 1930 in northwestern China. Every single one of those expeditions has documentation in Chinese archives that I was able to access by putting in a request, an interlibrary loan from my university in the United States. And then you get it, and these are the uncensored records of Chinese officials and scholars from that time period who are telling me what they think of Oral Stein, and it's quite positive. I'm just blown away. And I think oftentimes what happens, China often puts out these archival collections with just incredible stuff in it. I think it's oftentimes the people who compile it, the archivists and their assistants, are not actually scholars in many cases, and they don't truly understand what they have and what it's saying. And they publish these things because I think they have to justify their existence and the money that they get from the government sometimes. So they need to put out publications of things from time to time. And I've just been amazed over the past couple of decades of what Chinese archives will publish officially and how subversive and against many mainstream narratives the material in there will be, that they seem to have no idea that this is even in there. This is what I found for archaeology, but even in my first project on political history of Xinjiang, I actually found things that were published by local municipal governments in Xinjiang that were actually after the 1949 communist takeover. I could not believe it. This was like from 1956, and I found a compendium of reports that were written by a communist official who was investigating Uyghur and Kazakh strikes at factories. And he wrote a report on what their source of dissatisfaction was, what they thought of Chinese officials, Han chauvinism, all these sorts of things. And it was damning. And some bureaucrat in this tiny city in Xinjiang typed this up faithfully, put it into collection. It was a 500-page collection of archival documents. Most of them were completely uninteresting, but there were like 2 or 3 that had these incredible exposés of non-Chinese critiques of the Chinese after the communist takeover. You just can't find this stuff. So if you look hard enough and do your homework, it's amazing what you'll find. And it's often counterintuitive. It is weird for me to say as a Chinese historian that there's not usually a whole lot of value in even going to China for most topics.
I wonder where that bureaucrat is now.
I was thinking the same thing.
I don't think that Chinese officials and whatnot read actual foreign
right.
publications. So whatever I found based on that probably has no repercussions back home.
So, Justin, my other question was, this obviously pushes back against very popular narratives, in Western culture right now. What has been the reception by colleagues or critics, and also was it difficult to find a publisher who would, who wanted to put out this book in the way that you wanted to put out the book?
There's some interesting stuff to unpack there. My conclusions are politically incorrect in academia. They go against the general. If you never heard before, most universities and professors are very leftist. And this is not sort of the preferred conclusion about Western museums and how they got things. And so I've never really encountered explicit pushback. What I've usually found is that many scholars are simply uncomfortable with the conclusions that my evidence presents. So sometimes I've never, generally it's been received well, all right? And it's gotten me to the next stage of promotion and all that sort of stuff that you want. But what I have found is that when I sense that a scholar is uncomfortable with my conclusions, that this was not regarded as theft at the time, and I have the voices of the non-Westerners to prove it, and that is uncomfortable. The solution to that, to soothing that discomfort, is to take refuge in other things that I've included that can still critique the Westerners, because ultimately, most academics, I hate to say, you want to still critique the guys who had power and influence in the end. You can't let them off the hook, right? In Compensations of Plunder, the book before this one, I included, because I wanted to be a faithful historian, I didn't want to ignore it. These guys were rabid racists. I mean, they're pretty awful. I mean, they treated the people that they interacted with pretty well, and they got along well with the Chinese officials. But behind the scenes, they often had some pretty unpleasant, unnice things to say about the Chinese in general, right? When they're thinking in big abstract terms, Stein often criticized Indians in general, Chinese in general. But then when he's in person, he will make distinctions among Chinese educated elites and really cherish them. But then they'll often say horrible things about, the lower classes and whatnot. And I included that. I included that. It was part of it. I don't think it affected the nature of the transactions. I think from my perspective, you can have all this together. They can be awful imperialist racists who believed that the British Empire should rule the world and it was the best force for mankind. And at the same time, they could also have productive, mutually respectful relationships with people in the source countries who were totally fine with them removing these things. Both those things can exist. They don't have to be mutually exclusive. But what I found, maybe I'm just too paranoid, is that when people are uncomfortable with those conclusions, they'll simply highlight the racism. I've had reviews in which they said, "Oh, Jacob's book proves once and for all just how racist and imperialist and that these archaeologists were." And I was like, "Yeah, but that wasn't my main point. That was like 5% of the book. The other 95% of the book was showing how these things left China and was not considered theft." And it's often downplayed, and that irritated me. So when I got the invitation from the editor at Reaction Book, he was asking, would you be interested in writing a book on the history of plunder? And to be perfectly honest, I don't know if he thought that I was going to write a book on actual plunder, like this is all plunder and I believe that, or if he was really familiar with my work and he wanted me to take sort of the different tact. So I wrote back and I said, can I put a question mark at the end of plunder? And he said, yeah. And so when that was okay, I ran with it. And this time I will have to say, because I felt like previously some critics will only seize on things that advance the narrative that they want to tell and ignore the things that are inconvenient, like, hey, this wasn't regarded as theft at the time, and our valuations change. I admit I made a conscious decision in the new book to downplay the racist ideologies and highlight what I think is most important to understanding how these things crossed borders and ended up in museums. If you want all that, go to my previous book. But in this book, I didn't want that to be a distraction. And the reason for that is, it is a distraction, I think. It's not relevant to why people in the host countries agreed to let these things cross borders. Right? It's simply not relevant to their motivations involved. And so I didn't want that to become something that sort of takes over the narrative by people who might be picking and choosing what sort of things that they want to highlight.
I just keep thinking, this is maybe like a crude analogy, but I just keep thinking of like, the kid of a famed sports figure, needing some money, selling some championship rings, and then like 3 generations later, everybody talking about how those rings should be returned to the family because now some, great grandchild has like a huge interest in that sports history or whatever. It just feels really similar to me to these kinds of situations where it just wasn't valued by that generation, and then X generations later people start to care or think like, oh, it's just so wrong that these things aren't still in the family heritage or whatever.
Yeah, I make the analogy in the book that's kind of similar to that, where I say, as a historian, I'm treating history in this particular instance as sort of like a living will. It can be hard and uncomfortable to find out what people in a different generation believe and how they think things happen and what they want to do with their stuff. But I don't feel that I'm in the position to tell Grandma what she's supposed to think. She has reasons for why she thinks the way she does and what she wants to do with the things that she owns. And heirs might not like what they hear. But if you truly want to understand the previous generations, you're going to have to find a way to stomach it and say, you know what, maybe I'm going to try to reconstruct the context of the era in which Grandma grew up so I can understand fully why she's making these decisions in her will. for where, the disposition of the stuff that she owns. And I sort of adopt that analogy and I say, we should not be historical ventriloquists in which we're putting in, words into the mouths of people in history, which are essentially our own agendas, and looking only for the seeds of politically correct change, highlighting that only, and ignoring anything that doesn't support modern agendas. And I very much am trying to push it back against that and say, hey, you may not like what you hear, but all the evidence that I'm looking at points in this direction.
I was trying to think of not sort of counter examples, but of the reverse scenario in which you'd have uh, non-Western countries collecting or gaining access to the sort of cultural heritage of a Western, metropole or something like that. And the reactions that ensue from that, and the two that I came up with just had, it fell to the question of the Japanese. And there was a big sort of upheaval in the 1980s and 1990s when the Japanese were buying a bunch of real estate in the United States, right? And there was a famous thing where they took hold of Rockefeller Center in New York City, and there was a question about like, oh, what does it mean when the Japanese are like, taking these assets that are major assets and symbolic assets in the West. And there was a kind of uproar about that. We've seen a similar thing, a little bit more couched in terms of national security with regard to China and its investments in the United States, even though everyone forgets that China is the largest holder of U.S. national debt outside of the U.S. itself. But the other example I was thinking of is like also the Japanese penchant for collecting works of impressionism and post-impressionism, and part of that had to do with the opening of Japan in the 19th century and the sort of vogue for Japanisme in France at the time, and the influence that Eastern culture had on the development of Western modern art.
Right.
And but I don't, I wouldn't see you don't see the Dutch and the French making big arguments about the return of works by, Van Gogh to, to French national or Dutch national museums, because there's some pride in the fact that this work has been collected globally and has become a kind of, something that is extended beyond the boundaries of their national borders. And so I'm curious if, are there any sort of examples like that, or other examples like that that you know of that sort of, again, create more complexity to the story as we look at it today?
Well, I mean, the vast majority of artifacts, I think, fit the description that you were just talking about. Essentially, the people at the time, if they thought about the removal of this stuff at all, as you said, with like, the heirs of the Western empires today, generally saw it as flattering. If they thought about it at all, it was flattering that these foreigners have gone all the way around the world to collect our stuff, and they want to study it, and it was almost like, wow, they really care about our ancient civilization. In what way? Usually it was the Chinese who thought that. But the way that it becomes politicized later on, and it's definitely being politicized, is that now they become symbols of the power imbalance between the imperialist powers and the ones who, were not the main beneficiaries of that. And so most of the artifacts then get reinterpreted. And it's very much in the sense of, even if it's not explicitly said, very much the sense is that we were wronged, you benefited, immensely from the last 200 years, and this should be a symbol of the rectification of the power imbalance, is for these things to, be sent back. So that's why you don't have the heirs of the powerful Western empires usually calling for these things back in the names of the nation, but you have the people who did not benefit from Western imperialism as much, who are calling for these things back as a means of rectifying the perceived wrongs of the past.
Justin, I know you have to wrap up here in a minute. We usually have what we call the more opinion segment, and I don't know if we'll get through our three normal questions, but one of them we decided was inappropriate. We usually ask people if you could steal any work of art from anywhere in the world and have it for yourself, what would you steal? But we thought maybe more appropriate in this case is, is there an item somewhere in the world that you believe should be returned to its rightful owners that you would like to take and give back to somebody?
Something that belongs to its rightful owners and should be given back. Well, no, I don't feel too strongly about this. I actually try to stay away from politics and just sort of say, here's the history of it, do what you want with it. But I will say there is a very unique thing that's had a strange journey. It's known as Priam's treasure. Priam's treasure. It is a collection of necklaces and jewelry, diadem, that was found by Heinrich Schliemann, the German-American tycoon, in the 1870s at what he claimed was this ancient site of Troy, the Battle of Troy, on the western tip of Anatolia in Turkey. And he was one of the bad dudes in the history of archaeology. He openly flaunted Ottoman rules about what he was allowed to do, and he actually did deceive the officials, and did pretty much whatever the hell he wanted to when he found these things. He said, "Hey, this belonged to the ancient king of Priam. This is the site of Troy, and the Turks aren't fit to take care of this stuff." So that's an example of something that is definitely like theft. And if it could ever be returned, it should. And interestingly enough, when the Turks tried to get it back, they filed a lawsuit against him, but he had already left, and he tried to donate these things to Greece in the 1870s, thinking they would be grateful for it. Hey, this is from the ancient Battle of Troy. We can identify it as a Greek artifact. Wouldn't you want this? One of the most fabled battles of the Iliad. What was astonishing was Greece's response. They actually supported the Turkish side in the lawsuit and said, this is stolen. And we're not taking it on romantic notions of the ancient Greek nation, and you can't donate this to us. And they were going to seize it and return it to their hated rivals, the Turks. The Greeks were not on friendly terms with the Turks, but they were going to return this. And Schliemann was not going to get what he wanted. So he actually removed it. He took it from Greece and took it to Germany, his original homeland, and donated it to a museum in Germany to make sure that he had control over it and it would go to what he perceived as the most civilized place. But he originally wanted to give it to the Greeks, and the Greeks actually said, no, our political relations with Turkey are more important than your wide-eyed notions of the romanticism of ancient Greece. And then after World War II, when the Russians got all the way to Berlin, they actually took this back with them. They found it, Priam's treasure, and they took it back to Moscow. And for many decades, no one had any idea what happened to it. And then in the late 90s or early 2000s, it was suddenly rediscovered in, I think, the Pushkin Museum. There it was, lo and behold, the Priam's treasure in Russia. When there were some calls to return it, some people will say return it to Greece. Some people will say return it to Turkey. When there were calls, the Russians were very blunt. I don't know if it was Putin or someone else, but basically someone very high up said, this is compensation for World War II. We're not returning it. They were very blunt. They didn't make any bones about it. They said, we're keeping this. This is compensation for what we suffered during World War II. It's legitimate war booty, essentially. I don't personally feel very strong about this, but if you want a case for restitution, I think that's a pretty good one. A lot of bad dudes. Heinrich Schliemann was an unpleasant fellow, and the Russian leaders who said, military plunder, and we're proud of it, that's kind of unpleasant too.
Amazing.
We've got one more variation on that. Are you aware of any artifact that is privately owned, generally unavailable to the public, that not necessarily needs to be returned to its rightful owner, but that you really think should be in a place where the world can see it?
Private owner. Let me think about this for a second. Going through my mind, trying to think of the various places, private ownership. So it's tough for things to be in private ownership this long. Sooner or later, if it's really good, it's going to be donated usually, or there's going to be calls for it. And if they're wary of that, if they're wary of people saying, hey, this is a valuable symbol of some other nation, oftentimes they don't really reveal what's in it. And you often don't even know what's in private collections until someone dies and things go up for auction and whatnot. So to be honest, no, I can't think of anything that I'm aware of that's in a private collection that is so amazing that it really should be in a public place where people can see it more. I think that would apply more to sort of European paintings, that sort of art. I'm certain there's, really wonderful stuff, Rembrandts and Van Goghs and these hidden treasures that are probably in private collections. I think that's less likely for something like a Chinese bronze or an amazing ancient Egyptian artifact or something like that.
That's the best argument for a high estate tax is to make sure that these things make it out of these estates and into at least the marketplace, if not into public holdings. That's great.
Jonathan.
Let's let Justin go. It's been a great conversation. Again, Justin Jacobs, How Plunder? Question mark. Plunder. How Museums Got Their Treasures, published by Reaction Books this year. It's a great book. I recommend everyone go out and take a look at it. I think it's a great corrective, or at least a counter narrative to a lot of what we are hearing in the, I'd say the academic and the para-academic discourse around museums and what they contain. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. This has been a really stimulating conversation. So this has been nice.
Good.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Bye.